I've played quite a few first-person puzzle games over the years, ever since Portal opened that particular Pandora's box over a decade ago. And while it is somewhat trite to mention Portal every time someone makes a physics-based puzzle game, it's a title I don't invoke lightly in this instance. It might not have invented the genre, but it was the one that popularized the use of physics systems in puzzle designs. So many games have come along over the years that were clearly influenced by Portal in one way or another, and Relicta is no different. In essence, Relicta fits the term first-person physics puzzler about as well as you could imagine. It's mostly about moving blocks through levels in order to hold down buttons or transport you around. Both things are achieved by what the game calls magnetism, because apparently the cubes and plates you can operate are made of magnetic materials. But honestly, it seems more like you're able to just manipulate gravity itself even beyond mere magnetism. I say this mostly because the main attraction/repulsion mechanic is actually expanded with a third option that allows you to cancel out downward gravity altogether in order to fling these cubes around without them falling to the ground, so both types of manipulation do similar things. The game is overall structured in a handful of zones spanning a couple of biomes on a moon base, where each zone introduces a new obstacle in a handful of enclosed test chambers that you must overcome with the use of your basic powers, which stay the same over the entire length of the game. So while at first you only have to figure out ways to traverse these levels with the aforementioned cubes and mounted plates by giving them a polarity to either attract or repel each other, later challenges introduce switch puzzles, moving platforms, shifting scenery, and flying drones that cancel out any polarity you've set, so there's a variety of interactions the game gets out of its simple mechanic. And to the game's credit, it never overcomplicates these additional mechanics. A trap I've seen very often in these types of puzzle games that build up in complexity while maintaining a simple basic core of mechanics is that some think throwing in every conceivable obstacle at the player in a single level is a good idea. So it's usually a sign of quality and that the developers really thought about the challenge curve of their game if they managed to avoid this pitfall. However, the game does fall into another pitfall that ended up frustrating me at certain parts. As the term physics puzzler implies, the game relies on physics interactions. And one of the most important aspects of a game that relies on physics interactions as part of its core mechanics is that the physics must be predictable and repeatable. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case. So while you can set up your blocks and plates in a way that make you think whatever you're attempting is going to succeed, if the physics system decides to not play ball, you can sometimes lose all progress of any given test chamber through no fault of your own, and you just have to reset it. While resetting is not that big of a deal in the beginning because the initial challenges are all short and snappy, it can cause you to tear your hair out at later stages. Later test chambers are actually multi-stage puzzles where in order to gather the cubes to move on to the next chamber, you'll first have to figure out how to get these cubes to the main area of the chamber in the first place. And if the physics system craps itself just before that final hurdle, you'll have to do the entire thing from the top again, which isn't fun. Because at that point, you're not solving a puzzle, you're just executing a solution. A proper save system that saves this kind of progress would have been very welcome during some of the later levels. Another annoyance is whenever the developers think they're being clever by hiding stuff from the player. As an example, there's this one level where you're supposed to guide a cube through a little maze while avoiding the drone that resets all the polarities. That part is all fine and dandy, but when you reach the goal of the first part of the level, there's a second wall that requires you to place a cube on the corresponding switch in order to turn it off too. I happened to miss the block required for this the first time around and thought to myself that I was supposed to not use the block I guided through the maze to push down the first switch and instead push it down myself and guide the block to the second switch. Only after doing that, I realized my mistake. But the block was now trapped between the two walls, and I had no way of getting the block I guided into this situation back to me. So I had to reset the level and noticed that a second block was hiding away between those two walls in a little nook on the side. This isn't clever puzzle design, it just needlessly wasted my time. Another waste of time happened when a test chamber was very sloppily designed. It allowed me to lock me out of progress completely, forcing me to reset the entire section. This one yellow wall here can't be penetrated by either the player or any objects. You have to deactivate it by placing something on the corresponding switch. So you place the block on the switch, deactivate the wall, and use the teleporter on the other side to bring the block with you. After that, you have to use an ascending platform to get to the next section, which is at first blocked by a purple wall that only lets through the player but not objects. After flipping a switch on the other side, the purple wall disappears and is replaced by a green wall, which only lets through the cubes but blocks the player from passing through. That's how you're supposed to get both yourself and the cube up there. Only I missed that switch up top and managed to fall off the platform. Somehow I managed to fall in such a way that I passed right over the initial yellow wall. And since I now no longer had my cube to push down the button, since it was on the other side of the wall, I had to reset the entire test chamber. Simply raising that yellow wall a few meters so that it prevents players from ever being able to pass to the previous section of the chamber would have solved this problem, but it probably wasn't caught during playtesting. But the sloppiness doesn't just stop there, because there are levels you can solve in alternate ways that sometimes entirely ignore certain elements of the test chambers. And it's usually clear that this isn't part of the intended design. I'd say most puzzles are designed to be solved in only one specific manner, and I assume that this was the intention of every puzzle. But the nature of the physics interactions mean that you can sometimes luck out and achieve something that I'm sure was unintended by the designers but still manages to get you through a chamber. Take for example this late stage chamber. While I tried to use the wall mounted plates, because why else would they be there if the game didn't intend for you to use them, I never figured out in what manner they should be used, because you can just circumvent the entire thing by putting the cube you need to transport to the other side of the purple wall right up against it, deactivate the wall from the other side with the switch, and then use the plate behind it to push the cube to the other side. I have absolutely no idea if this was intentional, and I haven't used any of the other wall-mounted plates for that puzzle section. You might have noticed that I'm mostly focused on the gameplay aspect and haven't mentioned the story in the slightest here. And that's because I don't really think there's much to say about the story. It's a fairly generic little tale about a moon colony getting taken over by the titular alien artifact that's also responsible for giving you the ability to control magnetism and gravity. Most of the narrative happens over the phone because modeling, rigging, and animating people is hard, so don't expect to interact with people face to face. The story is also mostly told at you through not that great voice acting, and your character is either ordered to go somewhere to do something or decides on their own to go somewhere and do something. And as it happens, going somewhere and doing something always means passing through one of the test tracks littered with the test chambers. So in essence, the whole puzzle aspect, even though it's initially caused by the MacGuffin du jour, has absolutely no overlap with the narrative. It even goes so far that the main character points out that everything they have to do is always on the far side of one of the test tracks that can't be circumvented for some convenient reasons, so the gameplay actively interferes with the narrative instead of complementing it. I don't particularly enjoy these kinds of fourth wall breaks where the game highlights the tedium of trying to move on with whatever you're attempting to do while constantly being roadblocked by what should be the main attraction of the game. It highlights a certain disconnect in what the game thinks people show up for, because if you include a narrative that makes fun of the gameplay it forces the player to endure and makes it seem like the most tedious aspect of the game, you might end up causing players to ask themselves why they're even playing a game that makes fun of what players who like puzzle games show up for. And in fact, it did cause me to resent the later sections of the game, because the new mechanics they introduce aren't used in varied and novel ways. You're just expected to solve 5 or 6 challenges that involve the same mechanics, but they almost never ask you to apply the principles you've just learned in the first level of any given section in alternate ways in later puzzles. So they literally turn out to be roadblocks I wished I didn't have to endure on my way to wrap up the narrative. Between the puzzle sections, you have to walk through empty parts of the moon base that are built out of endlessly copy-pasted segments that all look the same. You can explore a few of the crew quarters, communal areas, and laboratories, but there's no real visual storytelling going on anywhere, it's just a stereotypical sterile sci-fi environment. The only background lore you can pick up on is communicated through collectibles that you have to go out of your way and find. It sets up this needlessly complex backstory of how these various non-Terran colonies went through revolutions, fights for independence, and how they are currently under a not too favorable administration. Which is why the team working at your base must conceal any knowledge about the Relicta seeping out from the colony. Honestly, the game just couldn't manage to make me give a shit about either the setting or the story it tried to tell, and the story actively made me not really look forward to doing the later puzzles because my payoff would just be more badly voice-acted narrative steeped in this terribly overwrought and yet still ill-defined setting. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend Relicta, not even to fans of physics puzzlers. I mean, the basic gameplay is interesting, and while I certainly had fun with some of the puzzles, its overall execution leaves to be desired, and the narrative lives in this entirely separate world from the gameplay, and it's just not an interesting tale worth telling. I think a good indicator whether a game was worth playing is provided with the fact that the game contains 2 additional campaigns, one of which takes place after the narrative of the main game, and I didn't even bother playing either of the 2 because I honestly had more than enough after finishing the main game.